Uh, Hi everyone, welcome to Baatein. I'm Ria. I'm a second year graphic design student at NID, and for those who are joining for the first time, Baatein translates to a conversation, and it's NID's unique interactive platform to learn and share. So we host a bunch of professionals in the design field and have conversations with them to kind of encourage growth and learning throughout our community. So for today's session, we have Kalapi Gajjar-Bordawekar. Kalapi is a typeface designer and font engineer. He's the creative director of Universal Thirst, which is a type design studio. They specialize in writing systems from South Asia predominantly, and he's interested in developing original typefaces for emerging typographic contexts and doing historical and technological research. So, hi Kalapi, thank you for taking your time out for this session.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
I'm good. I'm good. It's a unusually calm Saturday.
How's the weather in Bangalore?
It's excellent. I can't complain.
That's great. That's great.
Pretty good, yeah.
Cool. Okay, we'll get into it. So, your educational background is that you did your bachelor's in applied arts from MSU Baroda. So, and then you went into type design. So, how did this transition go from like a more graphical area to a niche like typography?
Yeah, so it was very strange. So when I graduated in 2010, it was kind of an interesting period in design where there was kind of this big transition happening from design being kind of this very, very few outputs of graphic design or of studying graphic design. Like you could either be just a graphic designer or go to like to an ad agency, or maybe you could do film and video. But there was this new media of like UI UX and stuff emerging, which wasn't really, nobody knew what it was going to be. It was still kind of this, not everybody had the smartphones were very crude, but there was this promise that there's going to be this everything connected, Internet of Things kind of a future that we are going to live in. So when I was in my third year and went for my kind of standard third year internship, graphic design internship, the reality of graphic design in India at the time, it may have to do just with the studio that I worked with, but the reality was that it was extremely boring work. There was a lot of kind of trying to copy what's happening in the West. There was no real thinking about your own visual heritage and your own kind of learnings from visual culture. And one of the things that was immediately apparent that whenever we had any assignments where there was a requirement for vernacular, so if you had to design a poster or a packaging design which required maybe Devanagari or even just one additional Indian language, I remember spending at least 3 days looking for fonts that worked, or at least matched the aesthetic that we were looking for. But not even that, even just worked. Like there were like none of the Adobe software actually supported complex script layout. So it was very hacky and very difficult. And at that time, I didn't really know that I wanted to do type design essentially, but there was this kind of thing that, it seems like there are these tools that we need as designers emerging in a market where there's going to be more and more need for language support or kind of representation at least. But then there is nothing to do that or nothing to use to kind of make your designs essentially. So when I went back and was in my fourth year, very typical kind of fourth year final project was to kind of develop a identity, like a big corporate identity design. So as part of that corporate identity design, I also created a very crude Devanagari typeface, which nobody's ever going to see. It's been, incinerated in a fire. But when it was on display, one of the jury members, who's Professor Shri Kumar from IDC Bombay, he was one of our jury, and he looked at the work. And IDC at the time did a lot of work in typography, especially in Indic typography. The master's program there kind of fostered people making typefaces. So when he saw that, he was like, oh, if you're interested in typeface design, then you should look at University of Reading. They have a very strong program, especially with regards to Indic scripts and scripts of other scripts of the world. And if that is something that interests you, then you should kind of look more into the course. And there is Dr. Fiona Ross, who still teaches there now, who kind of leads that multi-script design teaching at Reading, and I was asked to meet her. That's basically how I got into typeface design. It was kind of a series of, let's say, accidents, but also kind of keep it continuously asking why, how, kind of why not, you know. So, yeah.
Okay, that's cool. So we've dropped a bunch of like buzzwords, but I think a lot of our audience are kind of beginners and they don't know much about this field. So can you tell them like what is typography, what is type design, what is letter design, what are all these keywords and what do they mean?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So typography is basically arranging either small pieces of text or large pieces of text within a larger kind of visual framework, right? Like if you have a website, figuring out how text benefits the user in the best possible way, or the transference of information in the best possible way. Sometimes not even in the best possible way. If you're doing experimental typography, you want to kind of explode a bomb in the middle of the layout and everything goes haywire. But essentially, typography is kind of figuring out how to best design a piece of layout where text is easily transmitted to the person, information is easily transmitted. And then typeface design is kind of a lower level tool where you actually design the letters. So typography may elicit some kind of emotions. It may kind of bring through a particular kind of visual style that you're intending a brand or whatever piece, maybe a publication design to kind of elicit in the user. And then what typeface design does with the choice of typefaces, it kind of adds to that aesthetic. So it adds, if you want, let's say, to typeset a very long 600-page novel, then what you are focusing on is kind of a text that nobody like a piece of or typeface, a font that nobody really pays any attention to. It's kind of, you're just reading and it's ease of use. But then if you want something to, if you're walking down, I don't know, Colaba Causeway or like on MG Road, and you have like this big brand store and you want to kind of, suck attention towards you, then you want like kind of this more, ornamental piece of type, essentially. So what typeface design is essentially the design of letter forms, individual letter forms, and what typography is kind of the design of the text itself within a piece of within a larger layout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So what's the process of creating a typeface from the very beginning to the very end? So gathering inspiration all the way to like finalizing the forms and putting it out there.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very loaded question because just to kind of preface the process, when we work on kind of Devanagari typefaces, multi-weight, so more than one weight, and multi-style, meaning maybe there is an oblique, there's an upright, there is kind of a display style, a more text style, etc. If you have just, let's say like 5 weights, then it takes about a year to complete. So the process is much longer because you have a lot of characters that you need to draw. So there are 2 ways to approach typeface design, or 2 ways that it usually happens in the subject. One is kind of self-expression. So you're kind of developing a kind of typeface design that you feel is missing in the market or in kind of the entire kind of universe of typefaces that exist and kind of solve this very particular visual problem, right? So you think about this, maybe you also spark inspiration. So maybe you're walking down the street in Ahmedabad somewhere and you see this gorgeous piece of hand lettering and you want to kind of make it, it's only like 6 letters and you want to kind of expand it into a full character set, want to use it in a more kind of in-depth way. So there are those kind of ways, and there is more to that, not just kind of taking inspiration, but then you have the client approach. So you may have a client who says, okay, I have this huge brand or I have this small brand, and the typefaces that are available in the marketplace don't work with our brand. We want something that is specific, like it needs to look like this, and it needs to create this kind of it needs to generate this kind of an emotion, and it needs to work with kind of this particular kind. So then you have a commission typeface where you get a brief from a client. The briefs are complicated because there's a design brief and a technical brief, and we'll talk about that when we talk about font engineering. So you start off with a brief. It's either self-provided or provided from kind of an external party, like a client or someone. And initially you start in the Latin alphabet, you start with kind of a key smattering of letters. So the way I have been taught is to think about the letters ADHESION or addition. And that kind of translates the essence of all of the parts of the letter forms. That contains all of the parts of the letter forms, which then you can use to expand the character set to the full Latin set. And while there aren't kind of those kind of specific sets of letters for Indian scripts, because Indian scripts are a lot more varied, their patterns, the kind of the letter form patterns are not as repetitive as in the Latin script. You end up having to draw a lot more letters to kind of flesh out a design. So you do the design, and in the design, the spacing of the letter forms is included. There is, for Indian scripts or from scripts from the Indian subcontinent, there is this thing like, you have to attach the matras to the top and the bottom and all over the place. There are lots of these complex things. So those require other things called anchors, where you anchor a matra to the base glyph, essentially. So all of this is considered the design phase, and it's kind of this huge design phase. If you're working alone, it takes a lot of time. If you're working with a small team, you can kind of divide and conquer the entire design phase. And while humans like to compartmentalize design processes, a lot of stuff happens kind of very organically. So if I were to explain to somebody, okay, the design happens first, engineering happens second, some more quality assurance stuff happens third, and then you release the font. So it's usually not that simple. You end up doing some of the engineering way in the beginning to just test out your hypotheses of the design, especially when you're working with a client. You want to kind of send them PDFs and kind of test documents that show the design. And in that case, you want things to be working, and not like, if you want to just showcase a piece of text, or you want to showcase like a few words, then those few words have to be shaped correctly. So they need to have all of the conjuncts, the half letters, the full letters, the below base letters, all of the matras connected correctly, etc. So the design phase, once the design phase is complete, we kind of earnestly go into the engineering phase, which we'll talk about later, but that's the engineering phase. And then once the engineering phase is complete, there is kind of a design review and an engineering review. So design review also happens before, but you kind of go through the entire monster that you've made to make sure there are no bugs or there are no problems in the in the fonts. And once that is complete, then you move on to kind of figuring out how you release the fonts. Can you see me? Did I just... Hi.
Yeah.
Sorry, where did you lose me?
Okay, it's back. Okay.
No worries. Where did it stop?
You were talking about putting it out there.
Oh, yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, so once the engineering phase and all of the quality assurance phases are complete, then If it's a commission project, then you deliver it to the client. If it's a project that you're working on your own, you either collaborate with distributors like MyFonts, Monotype, Adobe, third-party distributors who are then going to kind of put your font out there, or you can start your own Foundry, like we've done, and then distribute the fonts through your own Foundry, and that's how they go out into the world. So that's kind of roughly an overview of the process.
Very complex.
Yeah.
I don't think this really covered all of it, but yeah, our next question is probably yours. So, you also went to the University of Reading. What type of projects did you do there? Like, what was their kind of specialty?
Okay. So let me maybe show you a few things. So I've collected a few. It's kind of walk down the memory lane for me because just for everybody who's watching, I received a fabulous set of questions beforehand, so I was able to put some stuff together, some visual references, so you can see what I'm talking about, and maybe put some context to it. So let me just share my screen so that I can show you. Let me see if you can see. So I'm not really sharing my screen. I'm just using this kind of presenter mode. So if you want to pin me, just go ahead and pin me, and then my video will become like larger.
Yeah. It's done.
Okay, perfect. So this is so when I went to the University of Reading, I was kind of I was a broke student, so I didn't really have a camera with me, and we were actually told it's a very small batch every year. So there are about 10 to 15 people every year. That's all. There's not more than that. And the University of Reading, of course, is in the UK. It's about 30 minutes west of London, in a small, tiny, extremely boring town called Reading. And then nothing happens there except for this massive university where you can learn all kinds of things. They were one of the first universities to offer, or the typography and graphic communication department was one of the first departments to offer a full-time one-year course in typeface design. So when we joined, we were told not all of us should carry a camera, because otherwise all of us will end up looking into cameras instead of actually looking at objects. So we were asked to assign one or two kind of class photographers. So what I'm going to share with you is kind of photographs by my classmate that he's very kindly uploaded to Flickr, and it kind of helps us go down, or helps me go down memory lane more often than I'd like to admit. So this is by Ben Mitchell. Ben is another typeface designer working from Brighton in the UK, and he kind of captured the various moods of the MATDs. MATDs are Master of Arts in Typeface Design. It's a kind of shorthand for all of us. And yeah, so these are pictures by him. The course is extremely, it's basically called Bootcamp for Your Brain. That's what the course director calls it, because there is not one kind of break that you get throughout the year. There are some vacations you get, but in the vacations you are trying to catch up because there is so much information overload. You're just going from not knowing anything about typeface design. In my case, at least, there were other people who had done typeface design before. But in my case, I went from knowing nothing to be like every day bombarded with new information that me as a 23-year-old had to kind of digest and process, at massive speeds. And the way the week is organized is Mondays and Wednesdays are kind of theory and history of typography days. So you'll have Professor Michael Twyman, who is kind of one of the, you will see him in a bit. He's kind of one of the people who established the course. And Professor James Mosley is another kind of person who established the course. So Professor Twyman on Mondays and Mosley on Wednesdays kind of take us into the deep history of letter forms. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, we have time with Fiona, or we have kind of other visiting tutors who will come and kind of, show their work or give us feedback on our work. And the Fridays are usually free. Wednesdays are only the first half is kind of teaching and the second half is free, so we can continue to work on our typefaces. So what I want to show is kind of glimpses from the days, so you kind of get an idea of what the days look like. So this is on Mondays. So this was actually the first day we arrived, and we were kind of given a hands-on training on some of the old typesetting equipment that is available in the department. So this is an old Monotype composing machine, which automatically kind of casts pieces of metal type, puts it on like this huge galley, which is just under his palm, and throws it out. So you take the entire piece of type and then it goes to the printing room and you print. So there is kind of this introduction to kind of old processes, how things were done in the past, and a kind of a deep dive into the history of typesetting methods, typography, typographic methods, history of typography, etc. Then every Monday we had this gorgeous class. So if you can see this is an entire classroom filled with printing ephemera. And when I say printing ephemera, anything, so ephemera is anything that's printed or an object that is not intended to last a long time. So if you think about newspapers or you think about magazines, they're all ephemeral. They stay for a while, but they are lost to history, right? After a while. The University of Reading has kind of this department of ephemera where there is kind of just over 1 million ephemeral objects from 200 years. So every Monday we would kind of walk into this room, and Michael Twyman would be standing there with his collection of objects, and every Monday it would be different objects. So the first thing you saw was just illuminated numbers. So if I go back, you can see it. So illuminated letters and numbers used as references for maybe sign painting, house numbers, etc., etc. And through this, he kind of teaches the history of typography, like teaching the history of typography through objects. And this makes learning very real because, rather than just looking at things or reading books or looking at things on a screen or reading books, holding things, smelling them, feeling how they feel, makes the object very real and offers you a lot more direct inspiration rather than just some random photo that you may find on the internet or a scanned piece of, like an old specimen that is scanned. So every Monday we had a different piece of history. This is illustrated children's books on one of the Mondays, and he has kind of this entire room filled with illustrated children's books. And what he would talk about is not just, he would talk about like everything that was required to produce that object. So we'll talk about the typography, we'll talk about the printing methods. So what were the common printing methods, the binding, the material used, what kind of paper, etc., etc. So you look at like a holistic view of production, of print production, right? Like that's something that's, this is these are like French fashion magazines from the 1800s. So lots of kind of illustrated pieces of garments and things like that. Here he is with packaging design. So there's just like the entire, again, room is filled with little boxes that might have had soaps or pins or like anything, right? Everything came in kind of these paper made things. So now you're looking at like three-dimensionality, how to store, how objects used to be stored. We are very used to kind of this very sanitary Tetra Packs, plastic sealed, vacuum, whatever, vacuum packed stuff. But here you see very kind of this cardboard construction, like paper architecture, paper engineering to kind of hold very delicate objects, like things like shampoo or things like solid soap and things like that, which may ooze into the paper or seep into the paper. So how has the paper been coated with wax and etc. etc. Anyway, I'm kind of getting carried away. But these are more images from, and this happened every Monday for the entire year. It was always a different subject. So he would bring in 18th century posters one Monday. It would be kind of a different thing. So every Monday was different. And then on Tuesday, so that's Fiona. The University of Reading also has one of the biggest collections of like the history of typeface design for like world scripts. So they have when Linotype was this huge foundry from Germany. When Linotype shut down, it's like these manual operations. You remember, fonts were a very hands-on thing. They were not made digitally. So when they kind of closed all of this, all of their production work, all of this material was donated to the university. So if you are really interested in, for example, the history of Malayalam type, you can actually go into the archive and pull just mountains of Malayalam typographic history, because that's just sitting there. So this is Fiona kind of taking us into the history of typeface design for index scripts. So there she's holding kind of a hand-drawn Kannada vowel, drawing of a Kannada vowel to show at what sizes those were designed to then digitize or kind of made into metal. So you'd have kind of this physical contact with physical objects of the past, and you would learn kind of through those objects. And then we would play kind of these interesting games. So obviously a lot of my classmates were not from India. So she had to kind of initiate them into, I mean, this was new for me as well. So there would be these flashcards of scripts from around the world, and we would be distributed into separate batches, and we have to kind of put letters from the same script together. And for people who don't know Bengali, who don't know Devanagari, and the typefaces are kind of very ambiguous. You can see they're not like really display typefaces, they're all text typefaces. So it's kind of, difficult to consider, okay, what is which script. So we would kind of spend a few hours figuring that out. Again, as a process to kind of get comfortable with letters that you've not seen before. And then, of course, this is Professor Gerard Unger. He's kind of he's a Dutch legend typeface designer who used to teach us 6 weeks in a year. So he would come every 3 to 4 weeks to kind of stay with us for a week, and he would keep giving feedback on our designs and also take kind of he also give lectures on either his practice or things that he has been researching. So here he's talking about diacritical marks, so the marks that go on top of Latin letters in kind of Slavic languages, so in languages from Eastern Europe. And then these are the crit sessions. So every day we would keep designing letters. We would print them out at different sizes. And this is Jerry Leonidas, who is the course director at Reading. And we would spend, the whole morning with him kind of scribbling over the letters, giving us feedback on what we should change and, how we should. So it was basically just this week happening, week in, week out. We were in the department from 9 a.m. to midnight, just trying to finish this boatload of work that we had got ourselves into. Here is Herod sitting with 2 of my classmates, giving them feedback. And then Jerry sharing more typography history, Greek typography history, because he's Greek. And then this is what kind of feedback would look like. So here is Ben's design, and then it's like lots of feedback given by himself, or kind of him kind of scribbling on his own printout, figuring out what needs to be fixed, etc. And that was our class. So that's the full 12 of us with Fiona, Jerry, and yeah. So what I'll keep this image on while I talk about what we produced in the course. So the course was divided into 2 big parts. You create one typeface family for the entire year, and you have to write a dissertation. So the dissertation can be kind of a historical dissertation, to write 12,000 words on a research topic. So I had written about diacritical marks or matras in Gujarati and how over multiple centuries. Their design has changed because of the change in printing processes and printing technology. And you had to design, and you had to kind of provide yourself a very solid brief for your typeface. So my typeface brief was kind of developing a typeface for children's school textbooks. So I created a typeface that was Latin, Gujarati, and a little bit of Tamil. And that's what I produced. Now I can show you what that looked like. At the end of the day, or the end of the year, we had to create a specimen drawing, which I think I've opened up here. Let me just find it for you, which is 1 second. Where is it? Sorry, just give me 1 second. Yeah, can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so that's what the specimen looked like. It's basically just showing off the typeface, showing off all the different aspects of it, the weights, the styles, how these accents connected to the typeface, and then kind of sample settings of what it would look like in a publication design, for example, or what the actual school textbook would look like. So here is kind of a Gujarati poem. So one side it's kind of a layout, the other side is kind of just showing off the typeface, and then there's Tamil here. Yeah, like a typical book setting would look like on the right-hand side there. Yeah, and that basically was what we produced in kind of addition to the typeface, in addition to the dissertation.
So you individually have to make one whole typeface.
Yeah.
And how long did it take to make that?
So we had from October the previous year. So 1st of October, or the first week of October, was when the course began, and we had until June to complete it the following year. And you didn't have to complete everything, so you didn't have to like complete all of the letter forms. You had to kind of decide what the content of this specimen would be, and then focus on just the letters that you needed to complete the layout of the specimen. And it differed because a lot of people were very slow and couldn't really do a lot. So they kind of kept their scope shorter, smaller. So not everybody did an Indian script. For example, very few people did, either Indian scripts or other world scripts. Others who were extremely good would do like 6 scripts, finish entire character sets, engineer entire fonts, and already have the fonts released like 6 years after that, 6 months after graduation, or like 6 months after finishing the program.
Okay. So then after you graduated, you went on to work at Monotype and also Dalton Maag. So what type of work were you doing over there?
Yeah, so I was at Monotype for just like 6 months. It was a very short time. With Monotype, I was working on the Noto project. I don't know if you've heard of the Noto typeface family. It's kind of this huge family that's supposed to cover or support all of the writing systems that have been digitized in Unicode. So I was working on Noto Sans Kaithi. Kaithi is kind of a writing system that is no longer in use, but it was used kind of in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and kind of that Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand area about 200 years ago. So it was a very interesting project where I had to kind of go into use again kind of all of these research methods that I'd learned at Reading on how to kind of find historical examples, from archives and things like that. So a huge resource for that design work was like the British Library, or going to the Oxford Library, things like that, and kind of getting old printed books in Kaithi, taking pictures of them, and then basing the letter forms off of those samples, essentially. So that was kind of my time at Monotype, but unfortunately, I was trying to find a way to stay back and continue working in typeface design, and they were not able to offer me a full-time role. So I was looking at other options to kind of stay back and do a full-time role in typeface design, and Dalton Maag had openings at the time, and I joined as a font engineer. And at Dalton Maag is a huge type foundry. When I was there were about 50 people working there. So there is the entire development force is kind of divided into smaller teams. So you'd have 6-person teams where you have like 5 people, 5 designers and 1 engineer. So, you know, whenever a client project comes in, it is kind of subcontracted to a tinier team within the foundry. And they kind of take the project from beginning to end, and the engineer does all of the research and planning. And in that regard, I had some excellent mentors, because Reading doesn't teach any kind of engineering. So I kind of just, again, like, you know, from a pan into the fire kind of a thing, where I was kind of in Reading, not knowing typeface design. Now I knew typeface design, kind of, but I didn't know anything about font engineering, and now I was kind of thrown into the font engineering deep end. But I had access to excellent mentors within Dalton Maag, like people who've been working in the industry for 25 years, who were able to kind of guide me. So I was essentially learning on the job, which was, I'm very kind of thankful and grateful to Dalton Maag for kind of giving me that opportunity. But at the time, they were undertaking a lot of projects that included scripts from India. So they needed somebody on the team that was able to give feedback, able to kind of figure out, okay, if something's going wrong, whether something's going wrong before they kind of release the fonts and things like that. So I kind of became their internal South Asia expert for those things, essentially. So we did a lot of like multi-script, large multi-family branding projects for large brands. So when I was there, we worked on the Intel typefaces, typefaces for HP. When I actually got hired, it was for a large Nokia project that covered over 30 scripts from around the world. So I was kind of in that, working for that, and then worked on multiple other projects, including their own library projects.
So foundries usually, do they work in 2 different areas? One is like client projects, and then one like ones that they self-initiate?
Yeah. Mostly. There are some foundries that may just kind of focus on building their own intellectual property, so building their own fonts. But mostly it is more economically viable to kind of do both custom projects and kind of self-initiated projects that then you can sell or distribute.
Okay, so you also mentioned font engineering. So could you elaborate what that process is?
Yeah, so fonts are essentially pieces of software, right? Like fonts have existed since computers existed, because how do you interface with a computer? You interface with a computer using text, especially the earliest computer, because you only had the command line and you could only work on the terminal, give the computer commands when there were no mice and keyboard. Well, there was a keyboard, but there were no mice. There were no user interfaces. So you just had, there were user interfaces, but no graphical user interfaces. You just had a terminal and you type in commands and the computer responds. So there was always a need for typography on the screen ever since computers existed. And as we know it, computers have kind of, transformed rapidly over the last 20 years. Like even when I was young, we had some really crude computers that couldn't really do much. And now I do banking on my smartphone. Like it's crazy, right? So while through this progression, fonts have had to be supported everywhere, like on the smartphone, on like even your like 900 rupee Nokia, where you could actually see the pixels. Like even there you had fonts, right? So every time there was an advancement in the OS or advancement in any kind of computing technology, there would be advancement in font technology, because now we have color fonts, now we have variable fonts. So the formats of fonts keep changing. And that means that the way you generate a font keeps changing. And you need to kind of test the fonts to check that they work on these different environments. So before 1991, so before Unicode is this kind of large consortium that encodes every character for every script it assigns kind of this unique hexadecimal code. So the Devanagari K is 0985, for example. So every character has a code. And what that has done is when I send you an email, the computer knows what the underlying code of that text is, so that the text is not garbled. But this was not true like as early as 1991. So you'd have Xerox PARC creating a different system. You would have Windows creating a different system. You'd have Adobe creating a different system. You'd have other like Compact Presario and things like that creating different system. And then they all came together in 1991 saying, see, we can't do this thing where our computers can't talk to each other, or we can't like communicate, because the internet is going to be this huge thing. So then they created this huge format, all encompassing format called the OpenType format, which basically meant that you had one font file which worked everywhere. Like whether you had a Mac, whether you had a PC, whether you had a Linux machine, it just worked on. And it was not just the OS, it was also the processor, right? Like there are so many differences. So font engineering is a way to kind of verify and prepare the font as a software so that it works everywhere. So it works on the web, it works on design softwares, which it actually for IndexScript still doesn't work very well. So all of that preparation work so that it's kind of a bug-free piece of software, that is basically font engineering. And there is a lot to talk about, but I want to not really go in depth. Maybe we can do a font engineering workshop at NID at some point. If you're interested, and we can hack some fonts and do some interesting things. But yeah, that is essentially fonts.
So interesting. So we actually visited like ITF, and we saw that it's actually a very small group of people working on a singular font. So we kind of expected to be this like corporation, but it was just like maybe like 4 or 5 people tight knit on one font. So like, is it just easier to work in these smaller groups?
Yes and no. I think it's not a problem of groups. It's the problem of availability. So unfortunately, we are always on the lookout for very talented typeface designers that have very high skill. Typeface design is a very interesting subject. So I don't usually like calling design art, and typeface design is definitely not art. So I'm not trying to equate it with kind of art, but what it is a very strong piece of craft. So you really have to kind of love working with letters day in and day out, because that's all you're going to do, right? You're just going to craft letters. There is this joke about typeface designers that the first week of working on a project is the most exciting week, because that's when you're coming up with the shapes. But then it's just kind of transferring those shapes to other letters, and it starts becoming boring. It starts becoming repetitive work for a lot of people. Now, a lot of people like me thrive on that kind of repetitive work. Like I love just working on these letters for days. Now, a lot of people don't, and that's okay. We have different personality types, and people want to do other things. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of typeface designers, and that means that generally typeface or Foundry, the Foundry size or size of designers in a Foundry is very small. So when you look at something like Monotype, which is a multinational corporation, it has like offices in Noida, in Germany, in Massachusetts, stuff like that. They still have just 8 designers. Like they were on the stock market, like it was that huge, right? But they just have 8 designers. The rest of the people are like marketing, doing technology, like software engineers, stuff like that. Again, this is a problem of not having enough typeface designers. Also, there is not enough work. So it's kind of a chicken and an egg problem. There are not an abundance of jobs because you can't just pay everybody to do typeface design, right? Like that. So it's ended up such that most teams across the world are small teams. So you'll have kind of small to medium size. So like 10 to 30 people is actually a great group of, like, it's actually a big Foundry. But usually 1 to 10 is kind of the norm, is where you have, or 1 to 9, let's say. It's different. I mean, like I said, for Dalton Maag, Dalton Maag, for example, has about 40 designers. when they became 40 designers, they divided the teams into smaller, like I said, like smaller groups, right? So I guess it makes sense to kind of have a smaller focused group of people working on one project. That way you can also do multiple projects. So that's another benefit of that. So you can do parallel projects when you have more people divided into small teams.
Okay. So after you worked at Dalton Maag and Monotype, you started your own foundry with your fellow graduate, Gunnar Vilhjálmsson. So why did you decide to work with Gunnar? Like, what was the reason behind it?
Yeah, so we get asked this question quite a bit. While the work was very kind of, I learned a lot at Dalton Maag. Unfortunately for me, the work started becoming very repetitive. And I reached a point where my learning was plateauing, and there was also no way to kind of move up the hierarchy within the organization. Like I reached a point where kind of I was kind of a senior engineer, and that was all that I could be. And at the same time, Gunnar was working for Monotype, so he was kind of north of the river, and I was south of the river in Brixton, and they're kind of rival type foundries. So it's like it was strange. But we were both in London, but every Sundays we would kind of meet and talk about, discuss kind of, okay, what can we do with Indian scripts? Like we want to kind of we want to create something that, people can use, designers can use. So one of the things that we were really interested in was kind of creating a resource, like a visual resource for new designers to use as kind of the launch pad for new designs. So let's say you have a designer extremely interested in typeface design, but doesn't know where to start, right? They can then use this resource as a way to find, it was essentially packaging Michael Twyman's Monday lectures into kind of a website and being able to offer them perspectives from the Indian subcontinent. So give them like those samples that you saw that were all in English, but what would it look like if we had that kind of a repository for Indian visual history? So we started like meeting every Sunday, trying to think about, okay, that's what we are going to do. We are going to quit our jobs and do the unthankful work, unpaying work of creating this online journal that's not going to make us any money, but we want to do it because it's interesting, it's fun, and it's very exciting. And another thing that is common amongst a lot of Reading graduates is because of the Michael Twyman classes, we've all started becoming collectors of old typographic items. So I would go every weekend in London, every like second Sunday and fourth Sunday of the month would be this Bloomsbury book fair where you could go and like buy really, really old books. And because we have like a long history of colonialization, a lot of Indian objects show up at these book fairs because it's like, their grandparents may have worked in the company, but then they brought everything back with them. And now there is this gorgeous specimen that has just showed up in kind of one of the shelves. So I've actually collected a lot of things from the UK. One of my most prized possessions is kind of one of the first Devanagari books printed in the UK, like from 1803, which I just bought for £25 because the person didn't know what it was worth. So when we kind of collected this stuff, we wanted to make that available to everybody. So that was kind of the main thing. So then in 2016, both of us quit our jobs and I came to India. He went back to Iceland. And then as soon as we quit our jobs and kind of the people in the industry realized that, okay, we are available for work, there was just coincidentally a lot of work from clients towards index scripts. So we kind of got approached by Google, for example, to prepare kind of library, like a best practice guide for their library fonts, and also create some fonts, also fix some of the fonts. I was put full time on the Noto project. So the Noto, I kind of took over the Noto serif maintenance, and I kind of have designed quite a lot of extensions to the Noto serif. It was started at ITF, and then ITF designed just the bold and the regular, and then I extended and kind of did version 2 of the designs by adding more weights, more styles, expanding the things and things like that. So instead of kind of focusing on that, developing that journal, we kind of got pulled into developing fonts again. So we kind of set up this studio where he worked from Iceland, I worked from Bangalore, he worked from Reykjavik. And we just started working on fonts. It was extremely serendipitous. We were never thinking of getting into fonts. We just were interested in doing something with index scripts or something with like writing systems from South Asia.
Mm. So you mentioned collecting ephemera. So is that where like the Universal First Gazette comes in?
Yeah, exactly. So that was the original idea. And thanks to one of our collaborators or staff designer, Salome, she kind of spearheaded bringing that out from kind of the Google Drive archives into an actual living, breathing piece of work that is now amazingly available to everybody since May.
It's awesome. Always
Thank
looking
you.
forward to like new updates.
Yeah, so we're planning to do kind of either like bi-yearly dumps. So you'll have like suddenly just like 6 new articles, you know. We are experimenting with the format. It's like it's our journal, so we're trying to figure out what's best works for us. And it's not very serious. It's not like an academic journal. It's it can be when it wants to, but it's mostly like a easy reading, quick reading. We know our generation we have very strong ADHD, attention spans are low, so we want to try to get some information out at least, and then they can always come back to the articles later on and continue where they left off. But yeah.
Why Universal First? Like, what does that mean?
Okay, so let me share another thing here. Give me 1 second. Where is it? All right, here it is. So this, can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is on our Instagram. There's also a post on the Gazette about this. So this is a type specimen that Gunnar found in India. It's by the Swadeshi Type Foundry. Swadeshi Type Foundry was kind of an old metal style type foundry that existed all over South India. And they actually created some of the most gorgeous metal typefaces for Kannada, for Telugu, for Malayalam, for Tamil. And in kind of the introduction to this particular specimen, every specimen had kind of this introductory note by the founder, like what is their vision and what is their kind of offering and how they're thinking about printing and things like that. So amongst that, there was this line that kind of stayed with us, which said that there is a universal thirst for types of new tongues. And we realized in 2016 that sentiment was still true, because in 2016 there was still just 4 fonts for Gujarati, for example, and it was like, that just is a perfect name for what we do, and that's how the name was born. You can read more in detail on that post if you want later on.
Okay.
But yeah, that's how that was born.
Very succinctly put together. Yeah. So both you and Gunnar designed for mostly South Asian scripts. So why were you attracted to this region in specific?
So I think it's basically just because there aren't enough typefaces that represent the visual scale that is possible with Indian scripts. Like you look at hand-painted type, you look at poster design, and you see this amazing variety of expression in typography, which is completely devoid from serious publications like books. If you look at newspaper design, you will see like a handful of typefaces, right? And even the more expressive typefaces are kind of usually hand done. So hand-painted type everywhere is hand done. It cannot be replicated, cannot be used multiple places. Is always usually site-specific. So you might find an excellent group of letters, but then those don't work as a full typeface, right? There are lots of these issues. And what that does is, as graphic designers existing in a time where representation matters a lot, we are in a surprisingly a period of dearth in kind of the variety of typefaces you have for any scripts, right? Of course, arguably, you have a lot of typefaces for Devanagari, but then for Odia, there are just 4 typefaces, right? Like, so it's so skewed, and then you have 600,000 Latin typefaces. So that scale is just completely, out of whack. So that was kind of the primary motivation. And for me, as somebody who was born here, brought up here, I think it feels right at home. Gunnar is like really fascinated with South Asian writing systems. He also specializes in the Arabic script, so he does a lot of Arabic design as well. So yeah, we just want to focus on doing more of the work where there isn't work being done. Like there's this huge chasm, and we want to try to fill that chasm with interesting, typeface designs.
Yeah. So most type designers are designing in like many different scripts, many different languages, and they may not necessarily know them. So people ask you, how can you design something in a language you don't know, you don't read?
Yeah, oh my God, this is a very complex answer. So yeah, I don't know where to start. I don't think we have a lot of time, but I'm going to try. So I usually use I use analogies from other parts of humanities. I'm going to actually close that because that's a bit distracting. I'm going to, so I use analogies for things like music and for things like, let's say, poetry, right? These are skills that that are not like genetically encoded, right? Fine art. It's not genetically encoded. You can be good at it in a way that you have the aptitude, you have the interest to do it, but the skill develops over time, right? You learn to become a poet. Successful poets have written millions of lines of unsuccessful poetry. So everything is a learned skill. For typeface design, there is a fundamental difference between scripts and language, right? Scripts is a finite system. Like there is only so much you can do with a script, right? You have a finite number of consonants, you have a finite number of vowels, and you have a finite number of modifiers, etc. And they combine in a finite number of combinations. You can't have just anything combining with anything, right? Compared to language, where you can do slam poetry, you can do constructive poetry, you can break the barriers of language, you can do rap, you can write Shakespearean poetry or Shakespearean prose. You can do so much with language, like essentially infinite. It's like the infinite monkey cage, right? If you put if there are infinite monkeys on infinite typewriters in infinite universes, in one universe, that monkey's written the entire collection of Shakespeare, right? Even not understanding what he's written, right? So the language isn't necessary to understanding the script system. It's always beneficial because you're able to self-critique very small things within the design space. Like, would this conjunct be would this conjunct be valid? Like, can you combine a th sound with a l sound? Yes, you can, because that may be possible. But can you combine a l sound with a r sound? R, maybe not, right? But when you know that language, you are easier to make that decision. So that's maybe one use case where knowing the language makes sense or adds to your skill as a typeface designer. But like anything, the script system can be learned. So you can look at typefaces, you can look at the history of typography, you can look at historical typefaces, you can learn how the script system works. So you know that on a Devanagari Ka, you can have an Anuswara, you can have a Chandrabindu, you can have the multiple U matras, you can have the multiple E matras, and a load of other matras. But you can't put a independent vowel on top, or like, you have to, so there are those rules that don't change. Mm-hmm. So as long as you know those rules and you know the visual history of the writing system, then you can approximate a very good amount of the design. right? And then it always helps for you to be uh, interested in a lot of other things. So you interest in visual culture, local visual culture, like Gunnar is like a big Bollywood fan, so he keeps watching films. He's like loves the posters. He has kind of posters all over his rooms, like that he's purchased from Chor Bazaar in Bombay. So like living, breathing through these, walking around these, like instill a sense of kind of these visual cues that at some point come unconsciously to your practice, right? And this is true for a lot of things. They're true for again, like psychology, for any of the humanities subjects where you have to learn, you have to spend a lot of time researching and learning that subject to get instinctive at it, is what. So it's difficult, and at Reading you learn an approach on how to become a good designer with scripts that you don't know anything about. So they teach kind of this approach of how to look at different resources, how to look at all of those things, and then you can make a good approximation of what things should look like. There's a lot more to this, but we can it's not easy, it's difficult, which is again why we don't have a lot of typeface designers. It's all kind of connected.
So when you are designing a typeface, it's a very like iterative process. Like you have like multiple drafts, and the thing is, even when it's like quote unquote complete, there still can be tweaks. So at what point do you decide to like freeze your work?
So that's where the art comes in. That's where you just decide, okay, this is done, and I'm not going to work on this anymore. And it is engineering or technically clean enough to go out into the ether. And that's basically how you decide. So that's for your personal typefaces. For client typefaces, there are deadlines, so you have to complete it within that deadline. Otherwise, obviously, you will not get paid and whatever. But there are certain parameters. The brief that you set for yourself in the beginning is very important, and that brief can change. But that brief is used as kind of a litmus test to check whether the work that you've done stands up to that brief. So not only the design brief, but also the technical brief. So let's say you have a client who says, okay, we need a typeface that works well on those really old Nokia phones, right? Like that have like 20 pixel by 40 pixel. So then you just test those fonts on the phone, like you emulate the fonts and test them. And if they work, then it's a very proof of proof in the pudding kind of work approach. As soon as you kind of met the requirements of the brief, you're complete. You're done with the project. But if it's a self-directed project, you may think like an artist and be like, okay, I'm not spending any more time on this. There can be infinite changes that can be made to this, but this is good enough to be released. And if I find something later, you can always make an incremental change and release kind of a version 1.001 or 1.002 of the typeface.
Okay. So you went from designing more like workhorse typefaces at Reading, and then now at Universal First, there are a lot more like experimental things. Maybe you can like show some of the work you do at Universal.
Yeah, I can show that. So it looks like that, but it really isn't. So we have a lot. Workhorse typefaces take a lot more time to do. The display typefaces are easy because they are less rigorous in their completion. So if you, for example, this one that you see here is Eli. It's a Tamil variable typeface designed by Anaga Narayanan. And the brief that she set for herself was basically, what would a Tamil typeface look like if designed by a typeface designer in the 70s in this kind of psychedelic movement? And if you look at all of the psychedelic posters and design around that time, you see this very bulbous forms and type styles. So this is kind of an investigation into that thing. And here you can see like it's a very beautifully executed typeface, but you can get away with a lot of details, right? Like it's a very organic, the shapes are very organic. So if the stems are not exactly the same, if the widths of the stems are not exactly the same, etc. It's fine because it's a organic typeface that doesn't necessarily have to do that. And that actually speeds up the process and you're able to complete display typefaces faster. So we do have a lot of workhorse typefaces. They're just not released because they are in kind of the process of completion, and they will be released soon. And then if you go to the next one, this is kind of a workhorse typeface. So this is Sarvatrik, which basically means universal. And this is kind of our neutral typeface with which we hope to kind of support almost all of the writing systems from South Asia. At the moment, it has Bangla, Assamese, Gurmukhi, and Devanagari, and Latin, of course. And it's kind of this very plain, very neutral design. So if you're doing kind of this, very clean multi-script branding or something like that, you could use this as a way to kind of harmonize all of the design elements within that design space. So this is Sarvatrik. This is another workhorse. This is, but only Latin, unfortunately. We have a Kannada plan for this and a Malayalam plan for this, which will come out very soon. This is called Merso, and it's kind of based on the Cheltenham typeface, which is this classic mid-century modern typeface that you may have seen being used by the New York Times. So all of the text typeface, when you go to the New York Times website, is set in ITC Cheltenham, which is kind of the original typeface. And this was kind of, we wanted to take it, it was originally commissioned by this magazine in the UK called the Gourmand, which is kind of a food magazine, which is why you see a lot of the imagery is very food based. And if you saw the videos I sent you, it has those egg yolks in it and things like it's like anything to do with food, which is what we wanted to kind of maintain. And it's essentially like a very expressive text typeface that can be used for like expressive editorial design. So the typeface is not, in the background, it has its own personality and it shines. It kind of shows off that personality, or it's intended to show off that personality when you use it. And then this is Uma. This is kind of one of my favorite typefaces. It's kind of it's a take on a monospaced or a quasi monospaced Devanagari. So what would, if every letter was the same width, what would, and then that gives a very retro futuristic vibe, like something from Dune. Like if we had like Dune happen in like Devanagari, then if you see all the consoles, you would have like Uma being used on the consoles essentially. So that's why also surrounding this typeface, all of the imagery is very kind of space surrealism. You see a lot of kind of, like intergalactic visuals. And then this is Seismic. This was originally designed in collaboration with a London studio, London designer, Fraser Muggeridge. He's a publication designer and just a graphic designer. And he was the graphic designer of the Dhaka Art Summit that happened in 2020. And the theme of the Dhaka Art Summit was seismic movements. So they wanted this type that went from completely neutral to kind of completely shaken out of its, out of its core. So you see all these kind of breaks that happen in the typeface. And these are all variable fonts. So if I, for example, click on this, those are not, what you see in the back are not After Effects animations. These are things that these are live fonts. So all of this technology is in the fonts. You can basically choose the variable style here. And when I change the seismic axis, you can see that they go from like a completely normal thing to kind of broken. And then if you move to the Latin, same thing there. And then also the weight is variable. So it kind of, it's a very kind of experimental typeface, good for, let's say, things like album covers and packaging design and stuff like that. So these are our kind of the first 5 typefaces that we've launched. We have about 4 more to be launched this year, one of which is an Arabic typeface, and then we have another 6 scheduled to launch next year. And all of these typefaces, by the way, for everyone watching, are available as trial fonts, fully featured for free. So please download them and use them. All of you guys at NID, download them and use them in your projects. Play around with them. Tell us if you find issues with them. They're all available for free if you just make an account, or if you, for example, there is a trial page at the bottom, trial fonts. So you basically have to just log in, and then you can download all of the fonts, including kind of the variable fonts and the static fonts, everything, and use them wherever you want. Yeah, so that's kind of the.
Yeah. So how do typeface designers decide, like, this is something that is way more expensive than this font, or how do they make it accessible to people or not accessible?
Right. A lot of that is very instinctive thinking. So there is no real formula to come up with pricing. We really haven't given it a lot of thought. So our typefaces are priced pretty expensive. They're in the top end of the market. We are doing that at the moment as a way to figure out if that price point is something that works for us. We will continue to experiment with that price point. What a lot of type foundries do is when they launch a new font, they will offer them at like 90% discounts, and for the first month, for example. And that's where they get like the majority of the sales. We didn't really want to do that for now. We might do that in the future. We are not really saying that, no, we don't believe in discounts and stuff like that. But for now, we are not doing that. Instead, we're just offering the trial font. So if you want to use a font for kind of speculative use, so let's say you have a project and then you want to try whether the fonts, you don't have to buy them. You just download the trial fonts, use them. If they don't work, you can move on to the next, so that you've not sunk that cost of purchasing a license. If you do want to use them, however, please support us and buy a license. And we are happy to even talk about discounts privately if you are like a not-for-profit and things like that. But yes, so pricing is all over the place. There is no, especially pricing for index scripts is very difficult because there is a lot more time that they take to be developed compared to just Latin fonts. So because the character sets are smaller, the complexity of actually engineering is easier or lower, not easier, complexity is lower. So we've not really found a perfect kind of cost that we are putting on the fonts, but this is what we are starting with. And if it doesn't work for us, it may go down or up depending on how the market adjusts us within the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think, yeah, we're kind of beyond time, but this is like a really great in-depth introduction to type design. Like I didn't want it to be like super technical. Like I was like, let's try to keep it surface level so people understand. But I'm really glad we, went in depth, because that's what it's all about. It's about the nuances and the intricacies of type design. That's just like how the subject is. So,
yeah. You can't, yeah, it's you can't scratch the surface, because every surface you scratch, you kind of find gold. So you want to dig more and
yeah, such a fascinating, little niche.
Yeah,
and then applied
yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just saying it's such a you think the study is such a niche, but then literally the applications are everywhere you look.
Everywhere. Because text is everywhere. Like text is just all around you. Just the last thing that I want to talk about is what you talked about, which is the Gazette. And this is a resource for all of you, essentially, who don't have access to, historical resources for, or historical resources with regards to the South Asian context. So we'll be continuing to release a lot more of this stuff. It's not only South Asian, there's also Icelandic design history, because we are an Indo-Icelandic foundry, just not an Indian foundry. So there is this gorgeous article on the 50 krona Icelandic note right here, which no longer exists, but it had like the Gutenberg press on and paid homage to the Gutenberg press, and how it kind of the process of actually designing that illustration for the note for the currency was done. So there's a lot of this fun, interesting stuff. Also, one of my personal favorites is kind of these going into the archives of the Bombay Samachar, which is which is a lot of fun. Bombay Samachar is one of the oldest Gujarati newspapers in Asia, and Salome went and met the people who run it and kind of dug into the archives and found some very interesting stories. And yeah, there's just a lot of that's Gujarati. I don't even recognize it. Like it's changed over so much over 200 years. It's one of the earliest printing examples from Bombay Samachar. But yeah, so that's gazette.universalthirst.com. That's it.
Awesome. So yeah, everyone check out the Universal Thirst website. Like I just keep showing it to people. It's so
nice.
beautifully
Thank
put
you.
together, the homepage. Yeah, and the Gazette, great resource. Cool. So
thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for joining us, Kalapi.
Does anybody have any questions or?
Yeah,
Are we out
there
of
is a chat,
time?
but yeah, there are not any questions here. I'm also out of time.
Yeah,
but
okay.
We covered a lot for sure.
You can message me. I can answer any questions. If you
Yes.
message me.
Okay. Is that free for everyone to DM?
Yeah, for everyone.
Awesome.
Everyone.
Cool.
Get in touch.
Nice. Okay. It was cool.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes.
And all the very best.
Yes. All the best to you too. Excited to see what comes up.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Bye, guys.